Welcome everybody. We've got quite a long reading today. It's chapter 11 and it's entitled David and the Golden Age. It had been a great day for Israel. Her army had won a decisive victory over the Philistines at the Battle of Elah. And now the victorious King Saul was marching back at the head of his troops. From every town and village on the way, the women of Israel came out with cymbals and tambourines, dancing and singing and crying with joy as they welcomed the warriors home. But the real hero of the day was not the king, but his brilliant young general David. Handsome, brave, successful, the most popular man in the kingdom. The words of the women's song were, "Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s," which must have been galling for the king to listen to. What was the secret of David's success? How had this farmer's son, this one-time shepherd boy from Bethlehem, reached the top so quickly? Nature seems to have endowed him with all the gifts: good looks, a quick brain, a warm heart, an attractive manner, and a flair for leadership. But what first put his foot on the ladder of fame was his skill as a musician. King Saul suffered, as we've seen, from fits of depression, which later on turned into spells of dangerous madness. His advisors prescribed the soothing effects of music to charm away his melancholy. In a land of music lovers, David's early skill, which later earned him the reputation as the sweet singer of Israel, as he accompanied himself on the harp, was enough to get him a place in the king's service and in the royal court. His charm won the king's heart, and he made him one of his squires. This was David's opportunity and led to the occasion which made him the hero of the whole people. The immortal story of David and Goliath tells how the Israelite and the Philistine armies faced each other on the hillside overlooking the Vale of Elah. This giant of a man called Goliath, armed to the teeth, used to shout a daily challenge across the valley to any Israelite to take him on in single combat. David took up the challenge. And Saul dressed David in his own clothing, put a bronze helmet on his head, and clad him in a coat of mail. David buckled his sword over his coat and tried to walk, but in vain, for he was not used to such armour. So David said to Saul, "I cannot move with these, I'm not used to them." And David put them off. He grasped his club, picked 5 smooth stones from the stream and put them in the shepherd's bag that served him for a knapsack, took his sling in his hand and went to meet the Philistine. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him for his youth. "Am I a dog," said the Philistine to David, "that you attack me with a club?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," said the Philistine to David, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David answered the Philistine, "You attack me with sword and spear and javelin, but I attack you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, which you have insulted this day. The Eternal will deliver you into my hands, and I will cut off your head and give your corpse and the corpses of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the world may learn that Israel has a God. Then all present learn that the Eternal does not save by sword and spear. The fight is in the Eternal's hands, and he will put you in our power." As the Philistine then started to approach and attack David, David hurried forward to meet the Philistine. Putting his hand into the bag, David took out a stone and he slung it, striking the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he dropped on his face to the ground. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, drew his sword from the sheath and killed him, cutting his head off. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they ran away. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and chased the Philistines as far as the entrance to Gath and the gates of Ekron. David was now the people's darling. Promotion in the army quickly followed. The king's daughter fell in love with him, and it was not long before she became his bride. The king's son, Jonathan, had become his closest friend. As the record says, Jonathan's soul was knit to David's. Jonathan loved him as himself. The shepherd boy from Bethlehem had come a long way in a very short time. But trouble lay ahead. The king's mind was becoming more and more unhinged. Jealousy of his popular young son-in-law began to eat into his soul. When the mad fits came over him, he grew homicidal, and on several occasions David missed death by inches from a throw of the king's spear while he was playing or singing to calm Saul's troubled spirit. When the madness had passed, all was well, and David was back in favour. But it was a precarious existence, and bit by bit, Saul's obsessive jealousy darkened David's whole future. For a time, Jonathan managed to placate his father. But Saul's jealous hatred could not be mastered. He saw in David a rival claimant for the throne, and told Jonathan he was a fool to defend the man who would one day rob him of his inheritance. When Saul tried to kill his son as well as David, the two friends knew that this was the turning point. David must leave the court and become an outlaw. So he fled the king's anger and lived the life of a Robin Hood in the forest of Hereth. For some time he had his headquarters in a cave at Adullam, and there he gathered round him not only his own brothers and the men of his own clan, but mercenaries, desperadoes, men with a price on their heads, and all who were agin the government. Their numbers grew to about 400, bold and reckless men with a lust for adventure, willing to throw in their lot with this daring young outlaw chief. So with his band of hunted men, David embarked on a hand-to-mouth existence in the Judean hills, living off the land, raiding the surrounding territories, often on the run when Saul and his pursuing troops got too close. Many tales are told of those days. For example, how on 2 occasions David spared Saul's life when he was close enough to have killed him. But none is more revealing than the story of how 3 of his bodyguards crept through the enemy's lines to bring their beloved captain a drink of water from the well at Bethlehem, his boyhood home. In a thoughtless moment he had uttered this nostalgic wish, and his men had risked their lives to gratify his whim. David was so moved that he refused to drink the water, but poured it on the ground as an offering to God with these words: "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives?" But King Saul had soon a greater problem on his hands than chasing David and his outlaw band. The Philistine armies marched against Israel, and at the Battle of Gilboa, the flower of the nation's manhood died. Jonathan and his brothers were slain. The king took his own life in despair. The kingdom of Saul was no more. The land of Israel was now a Philistine province. Meantime, David was in exile in enemy territory. When he heard the news, his grief knew no bounds. His lament for the death of Saul and Jonathan came from the heart. "The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen?" Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? But of course Saul's death changed the whole picture. David had now nothing to fear. On the credit side, he had his romantic story and his reputation as a brilliant military commander. He was the only man who could rally his despondent countrymen and smash the Philistines. So step by step, he made himself master of the situation. First of all, he got himself proclaimed king over the southern part of the country, presumably with Philistine permission. Then Saul's tough old commander-in-chief, Abner, who had made one of Saul's younger sons nominal king over what was left of Israel, came over to David's side. And soon after, the young king himself was murdered in his sleep. David was now in theory king of the northern territories as well. He had yet to make it a fact. Bit by bit, he nibbled at the Philistine hold over the country. Battle after battle was won. He now had the people behind him. He had the cream of the army and all his own skill and leadership. At length he could say that Israel was once again an independent nation. The Philistines had been vanquished. But now came the masterstroke that showed David to be not only a brilliant general, but also a brilliant statesman. The northerners and the southerners in Israel had lived for centuries in uneasy association. If David was to be the king of a united people, where would his capital be? In the north or in the south? Either way would perpetuate ancient rivalries and jealousies. Between the two, however, there had stood, ever since the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, the city and fortress of Jerusalem, an apparently impregnable island citadel in the hands of a non-Israelite power. It was a mark of David's genius, not only to see the advantages of having a neutral capital, neither in the north nor in the south, but to take by a stratagem a mountain stronghold which was overpowered only twice in the next millennium. So about 1,000 years before Christ, David installed himself in his new capital, surrounded it with a great wall, built himself a fine palace, and called Jerusalem the City of David. But he was determined that it should be more than the centre of government. It must be the centre of the religious life of the people as well. For this was no ordinary nation, but Israel, the people of God. It was a people that through all its ups and downs, and there had indeed been many, had never doubted that from the time of the Exodus under Moses, its destiny had been in the hands of God. David, for all his faults, was a deeply religious man, conscious that he held his kingship in trust, and that it was only by the providence of God that he'd become king. He knew too that in these warlike clans that together made up Israel, with their feuds and rivalries, the only bond between them was their common roots in the past, their epic escape from slavery in Egypt, which had now become a saga, and their toughening experience in the desert under Moses before they reached the land of Canaan. The memory of the Exodus and the desert wanderings, the recollection of the pledge at Sinai, the hard, austere life of those nomadic days, all this found its religious symbol in the Ark of the Covenant, the simple portable box which contained the stone tablets on which Moses had carved the Ten Commandments. When it had fallen into enemy hands, there had been national lamentation. For more than 200 years, it had been the sacred palladium of Israel, the symbol of the continuing presence of God in their midst, a reminder that they were not like other nations, but a people under obedience to divine law, kings and people together under the authority of God. David won it back from the Philistines and now brought the ark to Jerusalem and housed it in a tent, again a reminder of the desert days. As the procession entered the city, with the sound of trumpets and the shouts of the people, with the king himself leading the dancing throng, this must have been David's greatest hour. It's a long chapter, so I'm going to read part 2 tomorrow.